Welcome to SPA 25. My name is Abbey Steele, and I'm the host for the evening. I don't know or moderator of this very nice event that we've put together, taking advantage of Claudia López, the former mayor of Bogotá, who's been visiting Europe. So we are taking advantage of her visit and pulling her to Amsterdam to talk with us about the war on drugs and violence in Colombia. So first I'm going to introduce Claudia, give you all a background about her for those of you who are less familiar with her and her political career. And then I'll also introduce my colleague Juan Masullo from Leiden University. Claudia will then talk a bit about the actual situation in Colombia and violence there, and then we will have a brief conversation. Well, we will have a conversation among the three of us before we open it for questions to all of you. So it is my pleasure to welcome you all here. This is the first event organized by the Research Priority Area Conflict and Society within the Faculty of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the UvA, at the University of Amsterdam. This event speaks very well to one of the core aims of that research priority area, which is to understand how violence transforms, or how conflicts transform from nonviolent conflicts to violent ones, and also how we can potentially transform violent conflicts back into nonviolent conflicts. Claudia has a variety of experiences that speak to these challenges. She became very well known in Colombia as an investigative journalist who uncovered basically a huge scandal that connected paramilitaries to elections, and that became known as Parapolítica, where eventually 82 congressmen were convicted of having colluded with paramilitary narco-trafficking groups to become elected as members of Congress in Colombia. As part of that, she risked a lot to do that. These groups are very dangerous. And so for years, Claudia has lived under threats of violence and has had government-allocated bodyguards to live with. She also left the country for a while and was a World Fellow at Yale University, while she was also a columnist for El Tiempo, one of the largest newspapers in Colombia and South America, where she also confronted even the owners of the newspaper and was unceremoniously fired. Actually, while we were having coffee in New Haven, Connecticut, she received the notification that they have accepted her resignation for challenging the owners of that newspaper and the family. Following that, she started her PhD in political science. So she left her dedication to public service to become an academic momentarily, because while she was pursuing her PhD, she also decided to run for Senate. She won that seat. She became a senator with the Green Party in Colombia. Then she joined the Green Party ticket as a vice presidential candidate during the 2018 presidential elections. And in 2019, she was elected the first woman mayor of Bogotá, a city of 8 million, which is 10 times the size of Amsterdam for scale. And that same year, she graduated with her PhD in political science. So we will eventually, for those students in the room, we will come back to this balance between political life and whether or not a PhD does you any good in the real world. We will come back to that. And she's currently now, she completed her term as mayor of Bogotá. She's now at the Advanced Leadership Initiative or Initiative of Harvard University during this year on sabbatical. So we're really privileged to have her visiting. Her wife is also with us. Angelica, I'm going to embarrass you. Her wife is a senator as well and from Colombia, so we are blessed to have two very prominent women from Colombia who are political leaders in the country. We are also very lucky to have Juan Masullo, who is an assistant professor at Leiden University of Political Science. His research focuses on especially how civilians respond to violent contexts, either political violence or criminal violence, and he studies these relationships all over Latin America, especially Mexico, Brazil, and of course, Colombia, where he is also from. So I am going to turn it over to Juan now, who will, I think, ask Claudia her first question. So thanks, everyone. Can you maybe join me already in welcoming Claudia?
Great. Thanks, Abbey, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Claudia, to start, we would like to ask you to please give us a general overview of political violence in the country. It's always hard to know when to start, given a long history of political violence in Colombia, but we thought that maybe a little bit arbitrarily, one inflection point is the period of the big drug cartels in the 80s and 90s, the Medellin and Cali cartel. So if you can give us an overview of how political violence has changed and evolved during the last decades, I think this would be a good place to start, so we can also introduce the country to, or that part of the country, to those who are new to it.
Well, thank you so much, really, Abbey and Juan, for having me here, and thank you so much to all of you for having some time tonight to come to listen to this topic. So just to start with, I will say that it's absolutely beneficial for everything you want to do in your life to have a political science degree, period. For me, it has been exceptionally useful, really, both for my scholar life, of course, but also for my political life and public service life. I think to have the level of comprehension, of methodological rigorousness in understanding complex topics, I think that's incredibly useful. So political violence in Colombia is unfortunately, when you want to study violence or political violence, Colombia is the kind of country that will pop up as a case, because it has such a long history, both in the 20th century and in the 21st century, of political violence. Now, what it actually means is hard to say. I think one of the problems in Colombia is that we kept calling political violence to things that are not political violence, and that's part of the problem. So if we want to sort of, as you know, in the 20th century, we have like a civil war between the 1940s and 1950s. It was a bipartisan, really political violence, and I think that's why we keep using this term. Both the two political parties of the time, the liberal and conservative parties, both resorted to violence, even though they were also running the country. And the fight between them was to avoid the alternation of power. That was sort of the main cause. The one who is a presidential, very centralized system at that time. So whoever has the control of the national government has the control of the entire bureaucracy, of the entire military, of the entire police. And they were afraid, both parties were afraid that the one will use those elements to keep out of the contest of fair and free elections the other party. And that's mainly the reason why both parties resorted to violence. It was a very, very civil population was heavily affected by it in a time in which Colombia has roughly a third or even less of the population that it has today. We have 300,000 victims of violence at that time. And then I will say, out of the 11 peace agreements that Colombia has done so far, since then, probably the more successful was the Frente Nacional, the National Front, which was an agreement of both parties to stop using violence, in an agreement to share power, to alternate in power for 16 years, 4 different periods. So the side effect of that was that they excluded other political expressions, was just a bipartisan agreement, in a time in which other parties, either workers-based parties, unions-based parties, leftist-based parties were emerging. They simply exclude them and distribute an alternating power for 16 years. So that was the side effect, the undesired effect of that agreement. And it explains the origin, political origin of the guerrillas, different guerrillas groups. Of course, also the Cuban Revolution, the Nicaraguan Revolution played a part in it. And then I would say that's the second sort of generation of political violence in Colombia, which is the emergence of guerrilla groups with the specific, with a political agenda, either for political exclusion. I was forbidden from competing in electoral politics, so I will resort to political violence to pursue my political agenda. we have different types of guerrillas with different types of ideologies, platforms, international supports. And then we have the third, I would say, wave of political violence, which is the drug cartels. So in the 70s mainly, growing and exporting marijuana was already sort of an illegal rent. It was not really prosecuted, or it was not really heavily contested by the state. Quite the opposite. Many of regional elites, regional political elites, were sort of part of that business. It was not heavily contested by the state. It was a criminal rent. There was not a war against marijuana, actually. It was not that violent, I have to say. But it changed when the drug being produced and exported was not marijuana, but cocaine. So we became, in the 80s, the first producer and export base of cocaine, mainly to the United States market. And the United States declared the war on drugs and makes this not only its own policy, but the worldwide policy. And I will say that even though now, more than almost 50 years after the declaration of the war on drugs, there are plenty of evidence, I will say, in all fields of social science, either in economics or in political science or in sociology, about the side effects of the criminalization of this war, making it a war rather than a policy of regulation or a policy of confrontation, education, or regulation. I mean, you have many different options of policy. But because the United States imposed sort of the war on drugs policy, we follow that. And sort of Colombia has been, in my opinion, sort of the best student of the wrong policy, I would say. And it has paid a huge price in corruption and in violence pursuing that policy. Because as any economist will prove, as long as you have a demand and a market, you will have an offer. And if you only try to crack down that offer without doing anything on the demand side, the market will continue. The larger the illegalization of the market, the larger the rent it will produce, so the larger the capital accumulation to be able to recruit people, to recruit armies, to corrupt public officers. And so the more criminalized the market, the more the larger the rent, and the larger sort of the incentive to use whatever it takes, including force, to capture that rent. And then I would say the fourth, that was the drug cartels. Again, just to give you an idea, by the end of the 1980s, when we have paramilitary groups, we have at least two drug cartels, the cartel of Cali and the cartel of Medellin. One of them, the cartel of Medellin, used more violence against the state and a huge confrontation with the state. The cartel of Cali used more corruption than violence. Both of them use a combination of it. But we have two drug cartels, around 10 different armed illegal groups. And Colombia, the state of Colombia, spent less than 1% of Colombia's GDP in security and defense. Actually spent like 0.7% of Colombia's GDP. So for me as a political scientist, if you have 10 competitors of the state, 10 armed competitors against the state, and you spend only 0.8% of your GDP in building the state and building an army, able to confront them, is like an invitation to take cover. And that's exactly what happened. It was an invitation to take cover because the state looks pretty weak, pretty unable to provide security and justice. And I will say that throughout the 20th century, what happened is precisely this: a very presidential, centralized, exclusionary, both on the political terms and electoral terms because of the Fronte Nacional, and also in socioeconomic terms. Colombia is one of the most unequal countries in the planet. At that time, more than 60% of Colombia's territory was not really controlled by the state. So it is not a problem, emptiness is something that happens in physics, but not in politics. If you don't control properly a population and a territory, somebody else will do it. And that's what happened. In the second part of the 20th century, we went from 1 to more than 10 competitors. Then, because of the drug cartel's violence, the state decided really to take it seriously, the challenge, to strengthen the state. We did a constitutional reform. We created La Fiscalía, for example, an institution that were able to prosecute drug traffickers or something like that, because before we didn't have any sort of judicial system able to confront these big criminals. We strengthened the police, basically. So from the end of the 1980s to 2005, roughly 35 years, Colombia went from spending 0.8% of Colombia's GDP in security and defense to spend 5.2%. Now I have to say that 1.2 of that 5.2 was because of the United States money through the Plan Colombia. So the price is if you do your war with somebody else's money, but somebody else is able to impose the policy. You pay for it, you're allowed to do that. So the side effect, again, is that we need to pursue this even more fully, the war on drugs policy. The fifth period, I would say, is the period in which Colombia the most violent period after the 1950s in Colombia's history. In fact, if you compare to the 1950s, the period of 5 years or 7 years between 1994 and 2001 has been the most violent period in Colombian history. 10 million victims, 10 million victims. More than 300,000 people killed, actually. 8 million people displaced, forcibly displaced. Heavily violent against the civilian population in those 20 years. And that fourth period was the confrontation between the paramilitary groups that are called paramilitaries, actually because they were supported partially by Colombian army, by Colombian elites. And they were the remaining, the reason they grew is because they were sort of the leftover of the previous negotiation with the Medellin cartel. So to confront the Medellin cartel, the Colombian government uses many different forms of allies. The United States government was an ally. To strengthening the police was an ally. But also it chooses parts and members who defect from the cartel of Medellin, such as Carlos Castaño, for example, who was part of the cartel of Medellin. He's a defector of the cartel of Medellin, became an ally of Colombian police in the pursuit, in the confrontation with Pablo Escobar. And then 5 years after of taking down Pablo Escobar, and actually breaking down very heavily the cartel of Medellin, then this Carlos Castaño, who was Los Pepes, perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, Los Pepes became the AUC, which is the largest sort of confederation of paramilitary groups, and they grew massively throughout the country along the 90s. And at the same time, the guerrilla groups, particularly the FARC, because both paramilitaries and the guerrillas became heavily engaged in drug trafficking, not only in growing pasta de coca, but actually in the whole chain of exporting also cocaine. Those are large criminal rents. So in part, those criminal rings explains why both the FARC grew amazingly and expanded throughout the territory of Colombia, and also the paramilitary groups. And it was also a reaction, a political reaction against the democratization of the country due to the Constitution of 1991. So the political regime finally opened. No, the reason why it was being fought in the 1950s finally opened. Finally, the bipartisan regime ends. Finally, is sort of able and easy to create new parties to compete. One of the biggest concessions of the Constitution of 1991 was the decentralization of the country. So Colombia became a much more democratic, from the political point of view, country. And all this expansion of violence is not only an incentive of drug trafficking, but also a reaction to that democratization. Because with that democratization, new demands, new political demands, have more voice and eventually more representation. Land reform, for example. Colombia is one of the, probably almost the only country in Latin America which hasn't been able to do a land reform in 2 centuries. So all those, or belonging to the unions or labor reforms, all those new sort of political and social demands now have more voices and more chances to be in the table and more chances to be represented. So it's a reaction against all that democratization process. The 5th period, finally, is the peace agreement. It's the demobilization that happens during the 2002 on, first from the paramilitary groups, and then with Álvaro Uribe, and then with the demobilization of the FARC. So the 2 big dangers, the 2 big enemies, the 2 big competitors of the state, the paramilitary groups and the FARC, demobilize from 2002 to 2008-9, the paramilitaries, and the FARC demobilized between sort of 2012, the process started, and finished it like in 2016-17. And that's one of the reasons that I decided to enter into politics, because I said, well, if what my teachers and what theory of comparative politics and stuff tells me, which is there is a chance of deeper democratization if there is less violence, which in fact violence reduced because of both demobilizations, reduced heavily. The elites has to be divided. This is a very close regime. If they are divided, there is a chance for new forces to have a chance. And in fact, the elites were divided. Uribe and Santos sort of representing the elites, even though, of course, elites are larger. They were divided. So less violence, division of the elites, and a crew of many sort of social capital throughout the years. So I said, well, there are 3 chances. 3 big conditions for democratization are present. This is the moment to get in. And we follow Antanas Mocus. We will talk about Bogotá later on. And we decided to enter into politics. And that was the 5th process. And now I think, unfortunately, if you are talking about 5 periods of political violence, it's because there is something wrong in that country, right? Why it happens repeatedly? Why? Why you make demobilization after demobilization, peace agreement after peace agreement, and still today, 2024, we're talking about political violence in country, in Colombia. So the easy answer, I will say, is, drug trafficking. Yes. We have drugs, we have illegal drugs, we have the war on drugs, and that's why we have conflict. But there are many other countries involved in drug trafficking and don't have the level of violence that Colombia has. So it has to be something else. That will be my plain answer. And I think it's because really we haven't been able to resolve political issues through political means. Land reform is still an issue that we haven't been able to cover. The more wars and the more phases and the more periods of violence we have, the more victims we have. And so it's really a challenge for the state to cope with all the victims and victimization that it creates. There are people in Colombia who has passed for 1, 2, 3, 4 types different of justices, different of tribunals, trying to provide justice and reconciliation. So the process with the paramilitary groups creates its own jurisdiction of transitional justice. Then the process with the FARC creates its own jurisdiction of transitional justice. So the more it gets complicated. But the common element throughout the 20th and 21st century is that Colombian elites haven't been able to be really state builders. Right? So if they are threatened seriously, like in the drug cartels, so they went from 0.8 to 5.2, right? To create an army, they raised, by first time in Colombian history, they raised the level of income tax, they create a wealth tax. Along the 20th century, Colombian elites denigrate of anyone who proposed a wealth tax, will declare that person communist or socialist or whatever. They will claim that that person is related to a guerrilla groups, whatever. But then, in the beginning of the 2000s, when the guerrilla were not only killing and threatening and kidnapping poor peasants or middle-income families, but actually the very elites of Colombia, then they decided to create the wealth tax. And it was not communist, and it was not guerrilla platform, right? Because they were threatened directly. But then, after the peace process, it was, if you ask me how much is now, it's 3%. So we were for 5.2, and now it's 3%. And we have invested enormously in the justice system, but still the level of impunity that has Colombia, not only for crimes related to the armed conflict, but for crimes related just to public security in a city, theft. So this is a system that is unable to prosecute people who commit theft or people who commit, massacres. And that level of impunity is another reproduction, I will say, of political violence. So is impunity, is the unableness and unwillingness of Colombian rulers to be rulers, to be state builders, to create an state. A country such as the Netherlands has been building the state that it has now for 4 centuries. For 4 centuries. Right? It takes time, it takes money, it takes raise taxes, it takes to defeat corruption, it takes to create institutions. It's a cumbersome and sort of complicated process, but you cannot avoid it. Because if you avoid it, then these are the consequences. So I will say that's the sort of the overview, and we cannot simplify to a single cause why we still have political violence. I think there are structural, historical causes. There are the inability of the state to provide justice in the first place, the inability of the state to provide security in the third place. And yes, the war on drugs is another factor, but it's not the only factor.
That was a really remarkable overview of a very long period of Colombia's history. I wonder if you could now take the sort of implications of the most recent period of political violence in general in Colombia and the war on drugs and apply it to your experience as mayor in Bogotá. So how you just gave us an overview of the country where a lot of this violence takes place in the rural parts of the country that's far away from cities, at least since the Cali and Medellin cartels were destroyed. But so how does security play out in Bogotá, and what were some of the challenges you faced as mayor?
Well, I know that there is this say that an image says more than 1,000 words, so I decided to bring some maps just to help you out. So I choose the most recent period, right? The most recent period, which is sort of the period of the peace agreement. The peace agreement started roughly in 2012. It ends in 2016, the peace process with the FARC. So just to give you an idea, 20 years before, in 1997, the rate of homicides per 100 inhabitants was the double that in 2010. So it pays. It pays to build peace and reconciliation. It pays off. It saves lives. But it has to be in tandem with state building, with strengthening the army and the police and the justice system to be able to provide legal security, and justice. It's not to do peace building and reconciliation or state building. If you want to sustain peace building, you have to do state building. And I think that's the missing link. It sounds so obvious, like any political science will say, obviously. But it's not that obvious in the political debate in Colombia. So if you see, we went from 35 up to 25, 10 points less of homicide rates in Colombia during the peace agreement with the FARC. You can say, well, it's not that much. Well, it takes a lot. As you could see, between 2016 and 2003, we haven't been able really to move. It's sort of the same thing, right? So to reduce 10 points, actually we were 15. If we go to the largest part in 2000, a decade before, it won't be 10 points, it will be 30 points almost in reduction. So it's a huge reduction of violence. Now, it depends where you are in Colombia, you know. This is Colombia on average. This is Colombia on average. But the tragedy of Colombia's democracy is that everything happens to you depending on where you were born or where you lived. You have a very different experience in life. The place you were born or the place you live in determines in 70% your chances of life. That's the tragedy of Colombia. So let me show you that. So if you are in the green area, I used to think that I was a very smart, disciplined, educated girl, and that's why I had the opportunities that I had in life. No, I had the opportunities that I had in life because I was born in Bogotá and I live in Bogotá. So if you were born or you live in Bogotá, you are less exposed, by far, to political violence. But if you are in one of the red areas here in the frontier, here in the boundary with Ecuador, for example, and Peru, you're by and large much more exposed to homicide, right? Or the same, or the same here in the Caribbean coast, and here is the border with Venezuela. We have 2,400 kilometers of frontier with Venezuela, which is quite a challenge, particularly if your main neighbor is a dictator who is not interested in confronting crime, but actually ally with crime. That's quite a challenge. Because even if you push illegal actors on that frontier, what they will do is they will try to have a safe haven in the other way, in the other side of the border. So that's a challenge. It's also interesting to explain why now these areas. Why are they? These are the figures up to 2023. So these are the figures last year. That's the picture of last year, right? But so you see this is the average, but if you take out of the 32 provinces or states that Colombia has, and let me just give you this idea. So Colombia is 3 times in population the Netherlands, but it's 27 times the size of the Netherlands. So I have to admit that it's a challenge. But if you see, where are Colombian competitors? Current competitors. So we have dissidents from the FARC, who are in red, maybe here, mainly. We have former dissidents or members of the paramilitary groups. Here we say Clan del Golfo, and here we say Gaitanistas, but ultimately they are pretty much the same group. So the Caribbean coast, the north, that was the big conquer, the big win of the paramilitary groups, were the conquer of the Caribbean coast. And the control of the cocaine traffic near-shoring in the Caribbean coast. And the big win of the FARC was the conquer of the southwest, southeast. All this connection was the big conquest, the big win of the FARC time. We're able to connect all these areas of coca growing with this near shore in the Pacific to export. And the ELN, which is another guerrilla group, controls this part of the border. So when I talk to my professors in Harvard, for example, Danny Roderick or Ricardo Hausman, and I ask them, well, what do you think are the biggest sort of competitive economic options of Colombia in the 21st century? And they say, well, I don't know, clean energy, nearshoring. Well, we have nearshoring. The point is that the nearshoring is with illegal drugs, is with the war on drugs. So nearshoring is the strategic location near, that is what it's called nearshoring. You will try to accumulate the resources near to the ports of export. That's what it makes sense for any industry. Well, it happens the same thing for the industry of cocaine. And that's why this is the distribution of homicides. And there is a deep correlation, not necessarily causation, but there is a deep correlation between which group control where and if you have more or less violence. So we know because of Statis Calios and many people in the conflict studies area that when one group, whether it is legal or illegal, regardless, have control of the territory and the population, violence will reduce. Violence emerges when there is confrontation and dispute. So, for example, you see that here in the Caribbean, there are more control of the Clan del Golfo, the former paramilitary groups, much more control now, and less violence. There is no dispute. But we cannot be misled that it's because of state control, unfortunately. Here, what happens is that the FARC actually demobilized. It took us 60 years of confrontation and different negotiations with the FARC to convince 13,000 very powerful and wealthy men to demobilize. 60 years. 4 years of negotiation. The whole international community helping Colombia for that peace agreement. 500 pages. And they demobilized. 95% of them actually demobilized. And they did the cartography and they sort of surrendered the territory they controlled previously to the Colombian government. What you have to do, if you were not controlling that area and now you have to control it, what you have to do? You have to spend more or less? More. Well, guess what? We are spending less. Less. On average. On security and justice in general in the country and particularly in those areas. So what happens when a territory that was controlled for somebody else's is turned over to you and you don't spend to control it? It became a dispute, and that's exactly what is happening. So the disidencias de las FARC are located exactly in the same areas, and now homicide there is increasing. But but on average, as you could see, even though people here can have 80 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants, on average, apparently Colombia is doing relatively well on homicides. So when the international community see this, said, well, Colombia no longer needs help. Well, it depends. People from Chocó or Cauca needs help. Now let's see another figure, which is the transformation of organized crime. Local crime is different from national crime, is different for transnational organized crime. Those are three different things, three different rents. So extortion, for example. Extortion is something that is increasing since the very beginning of the peace process. And after the demobilization has been increasing, it sort of was steady during the years of negotiation with the FARC, and it has grown steadily and steadily throughout the years until now. When extortion is happening, so that's quite a different picture. When you have homicide, you don't necessarily have extortion. The type of skills or criminal organization that you need to cause crime or displacement is quite different than the one you need or use for extortion. So extortion is more located in central areas, is more located in cities. Actually, Bogotá, for example, is a huge victim of extortion recently. And when you look at theft, has nothing to do with transnational organized crime in general, with drug trafficking. Yet, it's the same thing. When the peace process finished, around 2016, it has grew steadily. Only the pandemic reduced it, but then it went back. So extortion and theft is increasing after demobilization, even though homicide rate is not necessarily increasing the same way. Because we have different phenomena, different organized crime, the evolution of different actors. And it happens the same thing in Bogotá. So this is Bogotá. As I mentioned before, Bogotá is 10 times Amsterdam in terms of population. We are an 8 million people city, twice Costa Rica or twice Uruguay, for example. And here is how the homicide rate is distributed. And Bogotá, on average, has almost half the average homicide rate of Colombia. So the average homicide rate of Colombia is 26. The Bogotá is 13, right? 13, 14. Depends on the year. So on average, we are a lot better. But again, it depends where in Bogotá. If you are in the south of Bogotá, in Ciudad Bolívar, you are heavily affected by homicide. Or the likelihood that you're going to be a victim of homicide is by far larger. It's the same thing with extortion. Extortion is much more located in the center of the city. And there are reasons why it happens. And theft. So here is where more of the formal employment of Bogotá happens. It's the expanded center. It's the expanded center. It's the more productive, is where more people mobilize every day. So only 500,000 people lives here, but more than 3 million goes every day at the extended center, right? And that's where theft happens. So it's a very different picture, it's a very different likelihood. What is my experience in Bogotá? I will have to say that we have sort of the same judicial system, the same police. It's a national police, by the way. His boss is the president, not the mayor. We sort of give money as favors. It's like a relationship with an adolescent, right? You give money, you ask favors, but you cannot hold the kid accountable, right? It's sort of the same thing. So it's a very pervasive relationship, I have to say. But it's the same judicial system, the same police, and the same army for very different types of crime. For organized crime, for drug cartels, for the Clan del Golfo. The guy in the police who's one day the commander of a unit against the Clan del Golfo or against the dissidents of the FARC is the guy that the next year could be the chief police of Bogotá. It has pros and it has cons. And I will say that in my experience as mayor, for a city of the size and the capabilities of Bogotá, it has more cons than pros. But we can discuss that later.
Thanks, Claudia. So one of the things that you mentioned when you gave us the overview is that not only political scientists, but economists, anthropologists, sociologists all agree that the war on drugs and the militarization of security and even cracking down on criminal organizations hasn't been effective. There's also a lot of evidence that shows that it's not only ineffective, but also counterproductive. Many times when criminal groups are pushed into a corner, then they tend to fight back, so levels of violence increase. There's also evidence showing that there are alternative approaches, moving away from the war on drugs, moving away from the militarization of security, that could be effective in at least controlling violence. Probably not solving the drug issue, not the drug trade, but at least containing violence. One argument that has been, so then the key question is, if we know that one thing doesn't work and other alternatives could work, why governments, local governments, for instance, are not trying to apply these alternatives more often. And one argument or one answer to this question is that policymakers and publicly elected officials do not want to try alternatives because they fear that the public will not support them. So they expect the public to be supportive of mano dura, iron fist approaches. Therefore, they find it politically risky to propose alternatives to the business as usual. From your experience from Bogotá and as a publicly elected official, what can you say to this? Is it true that it's hard to change things because the public will not support it, or there's room for alternatives to public security in Bogotá or Colombia in general?
Well, it depends what you want. I mean, as any policy, what is the goal, first of all? So I will say that I will have to strengthen security without surrender democracy. That will be my policy. Now, I think we are in general in the trap or either or. Either the war on drugs or the other alternatives. And I think that's a trap and that's a trick that we have been following. We should move away from it. Let me tell you, I'm living this year in Harvard. 23 states in the United States has legalized marijuana. 23 states, more than half of the United States, have legalized marijuana. And I, as a mayor, has to prosecute marijuana back in Bogotá. What the hell? I mean, it's like, really? What the hell? An industry that I can make an industry regulate export to the market to produce an enormous amount of products. Enormous amount of products. But we don't do it. So there are many different issues, I would say, that be naive also. Be naive that it's only health policies, health prevention policies, social policies, in the same sense that I don't think that peace and security replace state building. I don't think, either as a political scientist or as a mayor, that social and health policy replace security policy. So you need to have education, because people need to understand that whatever they consume, water or milk or drugs, legal or illegal, have effects. They have to be aware about the effects, the consequences, the risk. When we regulate something, and we regulate millions of products, millions of drugs, we regulate it for a reason, which is to inform the public what it produces, what it could cause, what are the risks, what could you do if you get into trouble, what could you do if you get addicted. So making the people blind and uninformed, I cannot think of any advantage of doing that, of any advantage. So if I can tell you as a father or as a mother, look, you have two options with your kid. She or he will be exposed to, let's say, 1 million risks. Would you like to have information about 1999, except one? Or you would like to have information about the million? There is just one thing that I won't give you information about. But it will be risky for your kid. It may kill it. Do you want to know or do you want to know? Probably 100% of people will say, I want to know. When we decided not to educate and not to regulate and not to inform people, simply to say, it's bad, it's forbidden. Why? For what reason? For what purpose? So we cannot surrender to that policy, and we have surrendered to that policy. And instead of informing and training people, when somebody can get into a problem with that, how to train it, how to treat it, whatever. So there is information, there is education, collective education, there is health policy, not all drugs. It's not the same thing to consume marijuana and certain types of marijuana that to consume cocaine or to consume fentanyl, right? There's a large variation on that. There's a huge heterogeneity on that. So when we simply say to the people, no, because there is a war because it's illegal, that's not good enough information, I will have to say. That's not a good enough information. So it's not either or, is what I will say. You need to have education, you need to have health policy, you need to have prevention, you need to have social economic inclusion, you need to have security and prosecution also, right? And eventually, you need to have incarceration and resocialization. So in my experience as a mayor, and one of the things that I tried to pursue, unfortunately I couldn't convince my colleagues either in Congress or at the national government. But I said, look, let's suppose that before an homicide happens, there is a huge range of issues of convivencia, of living together, and of security that happens. Theft, for example. Lesiones personales, I don't know how to say that in English, what is the expression of that? Or interpersonal attacks, or community conflicts, or domestic violence, or gender violence. Why don't we create a non-armed public servant, community service type, a police, and a judicial procedure, and eventually an incarceration just for those kind of things. Do not combine, do not mix them with homicide, which are crimes against life. That's a different thing. That's a different thing. And there is a different thing, there is a third layer, which is transnational organized crime, that not only kill people, but do money laundering, do extortion to people, do corruption, control population. There are three different types of things. Sort of organized crime, and not necessarily, crime, but I hate the expression petite crime, so I don't want to use it. But let's say less violent crime. We prosecute all these types with the same law. We send people basically to the same jail, ultimately. That's an absolute mistake. And that's part of, when I mention regulation, that's part of regulation too. Right? So in my experience, that's what you need to do. You need to have social policy, education policy, health policy. You need to have these three layers of policing, prevention, policing, justice, provision, three layers different, with three bodies different to do the thing. And of course, you need to take advantage. After 50 years almost, finally, the great achievement of Colombia, and it's a great achievement, I don't want to reduce it, but the great achievement of Colombia in Vienna, in the United Nations Commissions for the Control of Drugs, was finally to recognize, after 50 years, well, we got two papers that recognize that we should use all this set of tools and all this set of policies of the prevention to do harm, for example, up to transnational prosecution. So I hope that we had an agreement of using that variety of policies, that we can implement it and use it more wisely, I think.
Thank you. Is this working? Yeah, thanks. As a follow-up, at some point, these are not your words, but you said something such as, we need more security without giving up on democracy, which is definitely something I would agree with. However, what we have seen in many countries in Latin America is that short-term security comes at a high democratic cost. So if we think of Bukele in El Salvador, if we think of Bolsonaro in Brazil, so there's plenty of authoritarian leaders that have won on a platform based on bringing security to the people, at the expense of civic liberties, the rule of law. And this is something we are seeing recently also in Ecuador, which is usually was seen as an island of peace in the region. Now crime is increasing notoriously in the country. And in the latest referendum, we saw that a lot of people voted in favor of much more security, more like harsher punishment to criminals, extradition, militarization of security, et cetera, and et cetera. In a recent survey that I conducted with some colleagues, we found actually that Ecuadorians are willing to give up on the rule of law, so they are willing to support unlawful enforcement from the state as long as this brings security. Is this a concern that you have for Colombia? Are Colombians willing to trade off democracy for security? Can we have security without like harsher punishment, more enforcement, without giving up or trading off some aspects of core aspects of democracy?
I think so, but let me bring two different perspectives here. So this year in Harvard, when everybody tells me, hey, aren't you worried that maybe there will be a Bukele in Colombia? I said, we already passed through it. We already passed through it. We already have our own very popular Bukele. His name is Álvaro Uribe. He's now being prosecuted. He changed the constitution, was enormously popular. He was the one who raised taxes to improve security. Well done. He was the one who created a professional army, finally. Not an army of recruiting poor peasants, young members of very poor families. That was the kind of army that the Colombian elites expected for 100 years to take care of them. None of the sons of the wealthiest or powerful families of Colombia have ever been in the police of the army. Álvaro Uribe's sons never went to the army. So that's part of the democratization, and I think that's correct. To raise taxes, progressive taxes, to have a professional army, right? But what happens is that you have to do that for 300 years. Not for 3 years, or 4, or 5, or 10, but forever. If there is a reason why the national state exists, is to provide security and justice. That's the number one condition. That's probably the only reason why people is willing to give up their rights. Part of their rights. That trade-off between absolute freedom, that's the trade-off of the national state. We gave up part of our freedom, part of our totally achievable rights, in order for somebody, that's the state, to have the control and the assurance to provide security and justice under rule of law and accountable. That's the trade-off. But in fact, there is rule of law and accountability because that's part of the trade-off. Nobody's willing to give up part of the freedom and rights without rule of law and accountability, because then it can be used for abuse. So that trade-off is the very essence of the social contract of a nation state with a society. That's the very essence. So what we need to understand is what could be when we said, oh, these people in Colombia or in El Salvador, that they don't understand that they are giving up democracy in order to be protected, you know? Like, you need to understand what under which circumstances of abuse are they living in their daily life? How is to live under the FARC regulation in El Cauca? Or how is to live under the paramilitary unit in Santa Marta? Or how is to live under Amara in a neighborhood in El Salvador? How is to live under that regime in which your daughter can be abused when she goes to school. Your son can be recruited. Your business can be extorted without any rule of law and without any accountability. Under absolute uncertainty. So when we said that people is giving up something, maybe we don't understand that they already gave up everything. That whatever they could be more autocratic in the legal system, that autocratic regime or that risky of autocracy could be not as worse off and up to live under the Mara regime or the FARC regime or the Clan del Golfo regime. So we need to do more research, really, to understand better what is actually the trade-off that people is doing under different circumstances. And I will say, for example, in the case of Bogotá, in the most recent period, that have been, of course, very convoluted by the pandemic, by the social crisis of the post-pandemic. It's a very convoluted period, but is that the unwillingness and unableness of the state to prosecute theft. It's not even the FARC, it's not even the Clan del Golfo, it's just simply to prosecute theft. So we need to understand what it means in different circumstances to propose a better solution, to tackle a better solution on that. And third, I think, and that's in the case of Colombia, because, everything comes late to Colombia. Democratization throughout Latin America, alternation of power between leftist parties and right-wing parties happened throughout Latin America across the 20th century. Because of the civil war, precisely, of Colombia, all this democratization process was retarded in Colombia. So it came late. So the great achievement of 2022 is that by first time in Colombian history, we have finally an alternation of power at the national level with a leftist government. So that's a sign of democratization, that's good. But there is a huge polarization, I think, and confusion. When I, as a mayor, asked the President Petro, we have these challenges, we have these problems. How can we tackle this problem of security, so on and so forth? I'm willing to help with this, but I'm asking of you this and that. He said, no. It's simply about giving education to the youth. I said, Mr. President, sorry really to tell you this, but here you are speaking with the mayor who's making the largest investment in education in Bogotá's history. Nobody else, not even you. You were mayor of Bogotá 10 years before me and invested 3 times right now in education for the youth than you did. But for the mother who tomorrow in Transmilenio, in the BRT system of Bogotá, is going to be robbed and assaulted violently to take away her cell phone, and maybe got injured because of that, I cannot tell her, wait, I'm going to provide in 10 years the education of this kid. There got to be some process to protect that from happening, first of all. And certainly, I think, it's a huge mistake to mix this theft with this drug trafficker in the same jail. That's something you should not do. But again, social policy doesn't replace security policy. So I think mixing the challenges is not an issue. The key is to understand under which circumstances people are living, to have long-term investments of state-building procedures, I think. That's crucial. And distinguishing these 3 layers of different problems and different ways to tackle them is crucial to provide democratic, accountable, under the rule of law, but effective. And I think we're missing that link, the effective part. The fact that it is under the rule of law, it doesn't have to be ineffective. It could be effective, preventive, or according to the rule of law, provision of security. Otherwise, we're going to keep losing elections to populists who basically kill people. I mean, now the big achievement of El Salvador has been to overcome the United States as the country with the largest population incarcerated in the world. That's the huge achievement so far. Without no rule of law whatsoever. None. None. Zero. So how sustainable is going to be that? It has been effective to reduce temporarily the rate of homicide. How sustainable is going to be that? At some point, those 75,000 members of the Maras, at some point, either they kill them or they will be free. I mean, there is no middle path there. And they have to face the consequences of either path. So,
thanks, Claudia. So one more question related to democracy. Is this on? Yeah, I think so. So some of our students who are here today have been protesting the last couple of weeks against the University of Amsterdam, trying to get them to be accountable for various ties to Israeli institutions and also to us as members of the university. And I wonder, given your background also as a student activist, but also as a mayor that faced mass mobilizations, I mean, again, like on a completely different scale than what we've seen here last week, I wonder, like, has your perception changed since when you yourself were a student and dealing with it on the other side of things? Or how did you experience that? Can you reflect a little bit on that? And then I think we'll open it up to questions from the audience.
That will be like a different conversation for another hour and a half, but let me give you my
I'll cut you off so we have time for questions.
So one of the things that really amazed me is that in this university, of course, what happened in October 7th to begin with is a crime, is horrible. I absolutely condemn what Hamas has done to the Israeli people, period. That's terrorism, period. Now, throughout the months, every month that has happened since then, the response of the Israeli government, I think is not complying with basic rule of law from Israel or from the world. So it is obvious to me that this was going to be a tough, difficult, complex conversation. It is amazing that places that teach conflict resolution, political science, sociology, psychology are unable to plan and to have a tough conversation. What did you expect from the community? That this was not going to be an issue? I'm sure here, but I've seen it in Harvard. I mean, these are people who have been trying since October last year to have this conversation. It's like looking to another side. If we avoid it, if we avoid the tough conversation, if we avoid the cost of a state building, we will get it. Guess what? You don't get it. You have to go through that process. So that's really what more amazed me, is that places who are supposed to teach these things in a classroom were globally unable to use the people, the teachers, the scholars, the researchers, all the resources they have to plan this conversation and to have it and to promote it, actually, instead of avoid it. So I would say that's regarding the current thing happening sort of here in the United States and many other places. Now, in my 36 years, so this is my first year of sabbatical. I'm 54 years old at the moment. I've been in public issues for 36 years, in the student movement in Colombia, in the seventh ballot or Séptima Papeleta, which was the sort of the social process that ended up with the Constitution of 1991. I was journalist and researcher and unveiled the parapolitical issues on links in Colombia. Then I led with Angelica and many other people the anti-corruption consultation, which has been the largest initiative, popular initiative supported against corruption in Colombia. I've been throughout the years in all the process, supporting the peace process, of course. I was defeated in the referendum. I voted yes. Minimum part of Colombia voted no. So throughout the years, I've been involved in all these processes. And I'll have to say that in terms of Colombia history, I'm sort of proud that even under huge level of violence, speaking up in the middle of a civil war is not raising your voice. It's risking your life. And that's a very different thing. You may raise your voice. So the social movement, the student movement in general, the victims movement, the women's movement, different type of movements in Colombia. I have to say that I'm very proud. Every time that I'm sort of not as optimistic about Colombia, I just think about it and I'm optimistic again. Because if these people, under such severe conditions, are able to speak up, to promote the causes, to organize themselves, to get things done, there is no excuse for a person such as me to not do the part of the job. So I think that's a part that is always needed. That's part of democratization. It has achieved more. Even under violence, the level of social mobilization of Colombia has been huge. Under peace has been larger. That's one of the things that was expected. One of the reasons that I'm very disappointed about either, and I have to say, I mentioned this to Juan and to Abbey, and I want to say it now before closing. Probably many of you will do a paper, will be or not a sixth phase of political violence in Colombia. Will be or not. We are at the point, at the breaking point, in which there could be a sixth phase, very severe, or we can prevent it. As we speak, that's what's happening in Colombia, particularly in the last 2 years. Particularly in the last 2 years. And when I have to say that when it comes to execution of the peace agreement, probably to answer that paper, that research question, you will try to figure it out if the ideology of the national government has to do with complying and executing the peace agreement, being supportive of it, or not. I will give you the answer from now. You will run many regressions to find it out, and I will tell you the answer from now. The ideology doesn't matter. You have a right-wing government under Iván Duque who didn't comply with the peace agreement. And you have now the first very leftist government of Colombia who's not complying the peace agreement. So ideology doesn't matter. I will tell you that for sure. That could be good, that could be bad, but that will you find out after a lot of regressions and econometrics and stuff. Now, what matters then? Demands matters. Which kind of demands people? Which kind of people gets included or not included in the process, in the demands, in the give and take that political negotiation, and probably the hardest political negotiation is a peace agreement, because the stakes are quite high. You were unable in this university to have this conversation about a conflict that doesn't have such high stakes for the people who's involved. Imagine when really are high stakes for the actors involved. Right? So, is how willing and able to be a state builder, long-term institutional builder of institutions able to protect people, that makes a difference, regardless of ideology. Regardless of ideology. It was Cesar Gaviria from the Liberal Party, somebody that in 1990 you can consider a progressive, who did a huge state building in Colombia at the beginning of the 90s, and it reduces violence afterwards. It's not in the 4-year period. This takes time. It was Álvaro Uribe, very right-wing, 10 years after, Did human rights violations? Yes, but also did state building, investment in the state building. It reduced violence. And then you have either a right with Duque or left with Petro, who's not really doing long-lasting institutional investment for protection. And you will have violence, regardless of the ideology of the government. So there are other issues which matter much more. Now, at the local level, I'm also invited you to a second question, which is my government, and I have to say I suffer enormously, not only for the security in general, but particularly for police abuse in the city. So we have this period of extraordinary demonstrations in the city. The largest paro in Colombia since the 1970s. Huge. Because you have to realize that in a country that has suffered the violence that I mentioned, the poverty that I mentioned before, the inequality that Colombia has, in a year, because of the pandemic, we lost 20 years of social improvements. 20 years of poverty reduction. We lost it in a year. 20 years of social inclusion. We lost it in a year. In a year, because of the pandemic. So, of course, the social unrest that came after was huge. But it happens to me, half of my period, I have a president from the right, Duque, and half of my period, I have a president from the left, Petro. Both of them are the chief top commander of both the army and the police. And there was a huge political abuse, police abuse, in the first part of my period, and no abuse whatsoever in the second part. It was the same police. It was the same city. We had demonstrations after and before. So what actually changed was the top commander and the policy and instructions that the police is given. And it makes a huge difference in the city. Enough to say that the mayor was the same, because it happens in the middle of the period. That to say that that's another reason why I think, for Bogotá at least, public security, more civic engagement issues shouldn't go through the national police. I think Bogotá will be by far better off if it can have its own local police for local security and for local community engagement and conflict resolution, social conflict resolution issues, rather than with the national police.
Okay, thanks, Claudia. That's a really interesting answer. And I just want to re-emphasize your optimism that was in there, like in the middle, about social mobilization and how proud you are of Colombians for mobilizing. So I just want to emphasize that. So we have 10 minutes, more or less. So I think it's now a good time to take questions from the audience for Claudia. So would anyone? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia and Abbey and Juan. I think my first question is about your insights of the current situation that is happening now in the country, and based on the negotiations that the government is having with the ELN, especially, because now I think we are having a critical point in the middle of the situation that started as what the government was part of his a flagship initiative of the total peace, and now the complication of what is the ELN as a guerrilla group is now more divided inside, and it's bringing us to the point that now the phenomenon that we are seeing is localization of the negotiation. And my question here is what we are seeing here is also this fragmentation of not just the guerrilla groups, but also the process of starting peace building processes in the nation, not just as the entire nation as it is, but also as the need that sometimes is seen that because of the complications of enforcing, like bringing out like negotiation and a peace agreement, on this case, just the negotiation, it needs to be like localized. It needs to bring to the case that is happening now, that just like is the only negotiation that is like bringing kind of results is like the with this branch of the ELN. So I want to know what's your insights on this. Thank you.
I think there is another question right here. We can pick it up.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much. I thought it was very interesting, and yeah, just to hear it from the perspective of Colombia itself, because you've had so much experience there. One of the main priorities of the Dutch government at this moment is to fight transnational organized crime, and one of the main pillars within that approach is to work together with Latin America and the Caribbean. We also invested a lot of money on that regard. So I was wondering, what do you think the international community or the Netherlands or the Dutch government should focus on in helping the Latin American and Caribbean countries, and especially Colombia, of course, because of your experience? Thank you.
Thank you very much also. In your last part, you emphasized the social mobilizations after the pandemic in 2021, I think you're referring to. I'm wondering, how do you view the start of the initial protest in 2019, in November of 2019? And how was it for you to become mayor in such a turbulent period on the 1st of January, if I'm correct?
I think they're all. One more there.
Yes. Well, first, thank you so much. It's an honor to have you here. Me as a Latin American, it's really inspiring to have women in positions like you had. So thank you. I would like to know what was the role of the financial system or the banking industry into all of this? Thank you.
Just one more down there and we finish.
Thank you for a very inspiring event, and I wish I could vote for you. But last year I was at an event about crime in Latin America, Mexico in particular, and what shocked me, frankly, is that there were 3 students, young women, in the audience, and they said if I had to choose between going to the Mexican government or going to the cartels, I would go to the cartels, no doubt about it. There's this certain type of romanticization of cartels, organized, especially in Latin America. And I was wondering what your thoughts are about that, because it affects also the Netherlands, where drug taking is normalized. And I talked to a GP recently, and I was absolutely shocked at the effect of drug taking. I didn't know about it, and he talked to politicians about it, and they don't see the seriousness of it, especially for Latin American. And I say that as being a South American myself. Thank you.
Well, so the Peace Total, which is the flagship policy of President Gustavo Petro. I have to say that I was amazed when I heard. I think I was in the front line with Angelica at the start of the Gustavo Petro presidency, full of hope. And he mentioned that in the statement in his inauguration, right? That our hope is peace total with everybody. We're going to negotiate with all of them at the same time. That was quite shocking. That has never been tried before. Never been tried before. Maybe some governments decided to relate. I think was President Barco, maybe, who negotiated with different number of guerrilla groups. Betancourt, not successfully, and Barco successfully. So, there is a difference. I will say that this peace total, in fact, the closest memory that I can have for something similar to that was Belisario Betancourt. And it didn't work out. As much as Colombia has experienced, unfortunately, in political violence, it's also a champion in peace negotiation and peace building. Nobody else in the planet has done 12 peace agreements. So we have plenty of experience. Different methods, different procedures, different forms of negotiation, and I don't think the current government take a clear look about that. So it's a very ambitious policy without the proper methodology, I think, without the proper enforcement. You want to have a successful negotiation on anything, then you need to have enforcement. What happens if not? If my offer will be this and is taken, what will follow? If my offer is B and is not taken, what will follow? And it means enforcement of whatever of the options you're going to bring to the table. I don't see what is the enforcement mechanism that the current government is able to use at the table. In fact, what we've seen is that the ceasefire is violated systematically. First of all, it's given by surprise. By surprise, even to the actors you are negotiating with. I mean, the 1st of January this year, the entire country and the ELN discovered by Twitter that there will be a ceasefire. Nobody else the day before. The minister, the people in charge, the team in charge of the negotiation didn't know there was about to be declared a ceasefire by the president. So this is negotiation sort of by surprise. That's the method. And it's not working, unfortunately. So it's not about being global or being local. I think it's the lack of methodology. Is the lack of enforcement of what you're going to offer at the table. What happens if not? What happens if yes? Right. And also the nature and the evolution. I will say something that is complicated. I won't follow. Probably in the drinks we can follow the conversation. But I think that what we call armed political conflict in Colombia was over in 2016. Was over. The fact that we have a sometimes called guerrilla ELN doesn't mean that it has political means. It's not about over-toppling the government. That's not the purpose of the ELN. So that's the first mistake, I will say. The political armed conflict that originated in the 20th century was over with the negotiation of the paramilitary groups and the FARC. Was over. We can have negotiations. We can have. I'm not saying not. We can have political criminal negotiations to surrender to justice, different organizations, organized crime including. We can have that, but is that? Is not political armed conflict. So the basic mistake, I think, is this. But unfortunately, it's not going very well. That's sort of my vision for the total peace. Now, as for the Netherlands, I have to say, first of all, here is one of our former ambassadors from the Netherlands in Colombia, which I appreciate very much, that he's still pretty much interested in Colombia and here. And I have to say that I'm, as Colombian and as mayor, very grateful to the effort, the money, the support that the Netherlands has offered to Colombia throughout the years. The room, the maneuver that the Netherlands provide us to be able, for example, recently to change the drugs on policy in Vienna. You know, it may not be in the headlines, but it's incredibly useful. That's leverage from diplomacy, which is very useful for us to change that mindset from the war on drugs to the multiple policies of regulation of drugs, which is a different perspective. So that's quite useful. The support they gave for the peace process, for all the peace process, but more recently for the FARC peace process. But if there is something that I will require, and I put this in my book, Adiós a las FARC, there is something I will think helps enormously. I will mention two things. One is to cooperate with cities. I have to say I have a great deal of admiration for Frenke, the mayor of Amsterdam, and we cooperate very strongly. More than nations, people live in city regions. And these metropolitan areas need support, for example, to prosecute, to do intelligence, to uncover banking, money laundering, for example, which is mainly in cities. I mean, money laundering doesn't happen in rural areas in Bogotá. It happens in Bogotá. You need big markets to do money laundering, right? So, for example, creating a two cooperation agenda, one with the national government and another with the main city regions, Bogotá, Cali, Medellín, El Pacific, probably Barranquilla. So distinguishing that subnational cooperation agenda from the national agenda more formally, I think that's something that will help in the near future. And the second thing that I will suggest is to force the Colombian government to be a serious state builder. So if there is something in which the international community is putting money and the Colombian government is not putting money, you shouldn't put money, period. And let me give you a clear answer. Don't save them, don't save the Colombian elites the trouble to be state builders. I have to say, for example, desminado, to undo mines that were settled by different groups, particularly by the FARC. Unmining Colombian territories would have been for the money from cooperation, we would have been doing so. That's unacceptable. Transitional justice. Many parts, the Commission for Truth, for example, without the support of, there is more money from the cooperation, international cooperation, than from the Colombian government. Don't save Colombian elites. Right? Don't save Colombian elites the trouble and the responsibility to be state builders. If they cannot have a transitional justice jurisdiction with their own tax money, don't put a penny on that.
Maybe.
Because that's a trouble. Finally, the Latin American issue, the perspective about people who they sort of include or not, and the issue in Bogotá. Part of the issue, you have to think this. Why Latin America? That's a large challenge. Let me put it this way. Latin America is only 9% of the world's population. And it's almost a third of the homicides in the world. Forget about drug trafficking for a moment. Why such level of violence? It's 3 or 4 times, depending on the year, the proportion of homicides versus population. And one of the things is a large, enormous territory without proper control of justice, social inclusion, and economic inclusion for a large part of the population, particularly for youth population. So it's shameful and it's painful that for many kids in different areas, going to a criminal organization could be a better source of social and economic mobility than going to school, because there is no school at all, or there is no option at all. So that's part of being a state builder. You know? And that's why we need to push them to be serious state builders for social and economic inclusion, not only, obviously, for protection. And the mobilization in Bogotá, in fact, started all this pressure, sort of my account when I decided to enter into electoral politics. This is the moment. We have less violence, we have division in the elites, we have more social mobility at the moment. This is the moment to enter. Well, it happens. I entered in 2014. Some people entered in 2010. The point is, in 2019, after the peace process, in the lowest point violence, there were huge demonstrations and mobilization. Why? Because people can. If they can do it, and they do, risking their lives under violence, they will do more. And they will organize more for legitimate social and economic demands. That's democratization. That's a sign of democratization. Of course, when you're a mayor, that's a nightmare for you every night and every day. It's difficult, it's challenging. But I have this double lens. Like it's going to make my life as mayor difficult, but that's good. I mean, whatever is happening on the streets, that's good. If it is peaceful, of course, peaceful demonstrations. So that process started in the 2018, continued in 2019, and were stopped by the pandemic. And then came back as a backlash, enormous, in the 2021. But it's a process of democratization. It's a process of give and take. It's a process of people saying, I'm not willing to wait for the state to come 100 years more. I'm going to demand roads and education and health and protection and security. And now they can have a larger organization in Bogotá or in other places of the country. So as long as it is peaceful, and that's what we have to protect. We have to protect peaceful social mobilization at all costs, because that's part of the democratization process. And the only thing that will push the elites to be really state builders, to bring roads, education, security, and justice to a third of the country that they haven't never, ever done so, is the push of democratization. It's not because they are willing to. The offer side hasn't moved pretty much. It's the demand side what is going to move more. So never, ever give up. Not as a citizen, as a political scientist, or as a public servant.
What a great note to end on. Please join me in thanking Claudia López for her talk tonight. Welcome. Please stick around and join us for drinks around the corner as well. Thanks.
Thank you.